Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second Georgia Transportation Alliance webinar. We are honored to have with us this morning the Commissioner of the Georgia Department of Transportation, Russell McMurry, who's going to be giving a presentation on the facts, fiction, and funding of House Bill 170. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn it over. Before we turn it over to the Commissioner, just as with the previous webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and submit those questions in writing via the GoToMeeting at any time. And after the Commissioner finishes with his presentation, we'll open it up to the questions from our listeners. And now with that, let me turn it over to Commissioner McMurry.
Well, thank you, Sully, and thanks everybody for joining the webcast this morning and for this webinar. It's certainly an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to a diverse community and talk about the great things that are going on. And today I really wanted to touch on sort of three things, a little bit of aside from the transportation funding, which we certainly will talk about. But first is a little bit of an update on the 2015 Urban Mobility Report that TTI puts out every year. It's always a sort of a benchmark report to look at how we're doing on congestion as a nation, and basically we'd like to talk about where's Georgia. One, to dispel some of the myth that's always out around economic development, that Atlanta's traffic's so bad. Well, is it really? We'll talk about that a little bit. Secondly, we can't have any discussion without talking about what's going on the federal funding front and what lies ahead. So we'll sort of dive into that a little bit and talk to you about what's going on the federal front. And finally, sort of wrap up with the real focus of the day was the 2015 Transportation Funding Act, or Transportation Funding Act of 2015, or HB 170, as it was called last session, and the wonderful outcome of that and the positive outcome it means for Georgia. And so we'll give you a little update with that. But first, let's jump in and look at the 2015 Urban Mobility Report. You know, if you really need some excitement in your life and want to go to sleep at night when you're reading something, pick this up. It's a pretty big report, but it's reaffirmed several things I think we've seen as a nation, especially here in Georgia. One is the national congestion recession is over, and congestion, of course, tracks right along with the economy, and a sign of a strong economy is more people going to and from work and moving goods and services around their states. And the good news, too, is urban areas of all sizes are experiencing the same challenges that we had back in the early 2000s. Now, that may not sound like a positive, but it is. Again, it's a sign of a good congestion. Congestion certainly, I think that was the president calling. I'm sorry about that. Congestion certainly tracks right along with the economy, as we all know. And the challenge, though, that we have to face as a nation, and even in Georgia, is that Americans travel an extra 6.9 billion hours and purchase an extra 3.1 billion gallons of fuel, which has $160 billion negative impact to the economy. That's astronomical. And the really outlier of that, again, is something we certainly know a lot about in Georgia, is about freight and trucking, just in time and just on time delivery. Trucks account for about 28 billion, or 17% of that cost, which is more than their share of traffic, which is only about 7%. So obviously congestion has a huge impact on freight and freight movement, and that's something that we at Georgia DOT certainly understand, and will continue to work with the Department of Economic Development on strategies and all our stakeholders that help with freight and freight logistics to make improvements going forward. And we'll talk about those a little bit later in the webinar. The other things we've seen is from 2013 to 2014, 95 of the 100 largest metro areas saw increase in traffic congestion, and that's up from only 61 in 2012 to 2013. So again, I think the sign of the economy's on its way back as a nation, which is encouraging and positive, and certainly important for Georgia. So, but to put all this sort of in reality, or sort of what does it mean? Generally, on freeways and interstates, travelers had to allow for 48 minutes to what usually takes a 20-minute trip, and that's quite staggering when you got to think about that and plan for it. The other good news out of this 2015 Urban Mobility Report, which really reports on the 2014 data, is with the advent of NREX and having a lot better data now, this information is a lot more granular. So there's a whole lot more data, better data, that can be analyzed to really understand what congestion means, when it happens, where it happens, and a lot more exacting locations than previously. So this is certainly a great technology and certainly good information that really helps tell the story. And of course, when you got down to sort of the summary of this report, it's really sort of affirms the great things that Georgia's been doing and the things we'll continue to do. Is how do you make the best mobility improvement programs? It's in the mix of strategies, as we know. There's no silver bullet or just one solution that works. Adding capacity of all kinds never hurts. Now, I know that goes contrary to some other thoughts and principles, and as it relates to mass transit and what have you, they have to go hand in glove. Capacity and transit go hand in glove. Again, this is a national report, but capacity is important. Operating the system to get the best bang for the buck. Obviously, system efficiency means so much. Here in Georgia, we focused on the traffic signal synchronizations and using the best technology of adaptive signal control so that you can adjust the main arteries to real-time traffic patterns. Certainly gets operational efficiency out of the system. This 2015 Urban Mobility Report certainly acknowledges those are the kinds of things that need to be done. And I'm proud to say that Georgia's already working on those. Still a lot to do. A lot of technology can be deployed out there to make the systems work better, just like the ramp meters that have been in place for a long time on our freeways, the signal technology that we've talked about, the ATMS that we have in Metro Day, just like in the day when there seems to be a traffic crash around every corner. Our traffic management system has to be able to respond and to get information out through 511 and through our signs. So certainly getting the best bang for our buck, we understand and will continue to do. Another thing that they recommended was travel and work schedule options and encouraging home and jobs to be closer. And obviously that has two components. Currently, Georgia's working with the Georgia Commute Options, again, to get people to shift work times, to carpool, and take advantage of transit as well. So, you know, I think Georgia's making a good stab at those initiatives. And of course, as we've seen now with new mixed-use developments of work, live, and play type developments, that certainly will have an impact, and that certainly is a trend. And even just within the last few weeks, even some of the MARTA announcements of some transit-oriented developments in and around their stations, which will certainly change and curb a little bit of traveling behavior. So when you take these, when you take the Urban Mobility Report suggestions of how to solve congestion, Georgia looks like we're in a pretty good position of working on all those fronts now, and will continue to do so going forward. So that certainly is important. So where's Atlanta and where's Georgia when you start looking at this report? Trying to click ahead, and I'm frozen up. Can you advance it? Trying to bring up the next slide, but when you look at yearly delay per auto, so how much delay per car, Georgia's 12th in the nation. And as you look at this, I can count. I have 10 fingers and 10 toes, so I can count, but some of these numbers tied. Therefore, if you see, we have a couple that are at 8, and so there's some ties in there, but Georgia's 12th overall out of the very large city averages. So sort of contrary to the fact, and please dispel the rumors that Georgia or Atlanta has the worst congestion. No, it doesn't. You can see how they're ranked right here. And also, when you look at a little bit more how Atlanta rates nationally in these top urban areas, is a travel time index of 1.24, meaning that it takes you 1.24 times longer to get to somewhere during the busiest hours than it does when there's, say, Sunday morning, okay, when traffic's light. But we rank 25th overall on travel time index. So that's not too bad. It's not, you know, obviously we want to do better, but we're not, you know, the worst offender. The excess fuel usage, we rank 44th out of, I think it was the 50 cities, out of 50 cities. So that's not bad result. And the consumption cost per user is an additional $1,130 a year or we ranked 22nd. Now, that's a number we should drive down. We shouldn't want to stand for an additional $1,130 a year for that congestion cost to the drivers in Metro Atlanta. So there's a lot of things that we'll do to help mitigate that and manage that, especially through our managed lanes, and I'll talk about that a little later in the webinar. But really just wanted to give you an overview of this great report. It's a lot of good data, a lot of good information that hopefully you can help dispel rumors when people talks about how bad traffic is in Atlanta. Yes, we have congestion. Yes, that's a sign of a strong and robust economy. Yes, do we need to do more about it? Yes, we are, and yes, we will. But also, we're not the worst. And I think that gives a lot of perspective. So moving along from that, let's move into the federal funding arena. Let me bring you up to speed on that situation of what's going on. Here's a graphic of what gridlock in Washington looks like, literally. I always like to show this picture of what gridlock looks like in Washington. And I guess I'm proud to say is I don't think we're at gridlock anymore with transportation funding and how to deal with transportation funding in Washington. Between the House and the Senate, there seems to be at least a consensus and an understanding that something has to be done. So that's positive. We are in our second extension of this fiscal year, and it actually funds transportation for the nation through the rest of the federal fiscal year, which is through this month, and into just about all of October as well. But that brings consequences with it. So this is actually the 33rd extension of the transportation funding bill. And just to give you a little basis, most transportation funding bills are 6 years. But we're on our 33rd extension of the previous 6-year bill, which is not very sustainable, and it certainly gives transportation agencies across the nation a challenge when we try to deliver and meet our public's expectations. Congress passed this last extension back before the summer recess, and they're back now. They're coming back from their Labor Day recess and back in session, and it appears that things will begin to move forward to try to resolve this. It's important that it gets resolved before the October 29th date. There are some rumblings that there may be enough funding to carry funding through the end of the calendar year. But again, that would be a short-term extension, which is something we're not very desirable with. So what we're really looking for is a federal transportation bill, and we were concerned that Congress had lost sight of what that really looked like, so we found them. We found the transportation bill roaming around in some trade show, and we wanted to get a picture and show that Congress that this is what we're looking for. And they actually call it the highway bill, but we're going to call it the transportation bill. So this is our goal. We need to find the bill. What this has meant for Georgia with these 2 extensions in this year, from our original authorization, plus 2 extensions, plus the fact that our federal program is a reimbursable program, meaning that Georgia DOT and we use your tax dollars to pay for the work that's done, services performed, work performed first, and send a bill to the Federal Highway Administration that reimburses us 80 cents on the dollar, and we do that about every 2 weeks. And so when you add up all those, the simple math is this year there's been hundreds and hundreds, literally over 200 projects delayed at one time because of this federal uncertainty. And I think what most people lose sight of, even though it sounds like federal transportation has been fully funded this year, which it is now, with these 2 extensions, we have not been able to conduct business as usual. Our goal is to use all our federal obligation authority, the money that is due Georgia from Congress, by the end of the state fiscal year, which ends in June 30th. And that's been our standing practice, that we will put our state fiscal year and our federal fiscal year together, marry them together, such that we can spend the money concurrently and then ultimately front a little bit of the first quarter of the state fiscal year until such time that the next federal reauthorization has happened. That's a lot said to basically say is, since we are reimbursable and when there has not been funding certainty, the state of Georgia could not take the financial risk of not knowing that there were federal funds coming, such that we've had to slow down and delay literally at one point over 200 projects. Now we will be able to deliver all those that we anticipated delivered. We had anticipated to deliver those projects before July 1. Now we will have to meter those out until the end of September, which obviously has slowed down delivery of projects and has certainly an impact on the construction industry. But at the end result is we can't get our projects delivered to the public as expected, and that certainly is a concern. So when Congress left before the recess, the Senate had worked up something called the DRIVE Act, and that's an acronym for something I can't even remember. But what it did was looked at transferring the shortfall, or about $46 billion, from the general fund to cover the shortfall for only 3 years. It was actually a 6-year bill, but the funding, as is shown on the slide, was where they were coming up with the pay-fors, if you would, and the offsets out of the general fund to cover the gap, to meet the obligations, and to keep transportation funding really at a level basis. Was small percentage increase year over year. And you can see the sources of those revenues that Congress was looking at, the Senate was looking at. Of course, this was what the Senate was proposing. Of course, what we ended up with was the House passing the short term, which in my opinion was probably the right move due to the timing of the DRIVE Act, and some of the things we'll talk about. Certainly is a good start, but I think the House certainly deserves a crack at it, and to have their input on what this ultimately becomes. So some of the key tenets about the DRIVE Act we need to talk about. See if you can advance the slide. Trying to advance the slide, so pardon me just 1 second. As that slide tries to advance, some of the things in the DRIVE Act of importance that we think was good was it retains the existing programs under the previous transportation bill called MAP 21. Those are things that are like the National Highway Program, the safety component, the surface transportation programs, all the major categories that we use to the buckets of money, if you will, to deliver transportation projects in Georgia. So very good notions in the DRIVE Act, kept those. It actually created a new funding program called the Freight Program. Sort of Georgia's share of that would be about $382 million over 6 years. And such is a good notion, because in Georgia we know how vital freight and logistics are for the prosperity of this state. And we've made big investments in those freight corridors and will continue to do so. However, some of the concerns of that good notion of creating a federal funded freight program sort of gets involved in how the federal government sort of mandates that you manage and deliver those projects. We like the idea of the notion that we would have dedicated funding, but we feel like Georgia would be in the best position to make those strategic decisions using our collaborative effort that we've already done, using our stakeholders from freight and logistic companies, the Chamber of Commerce, the economic development, and all the critical stakeholders that understand good and freight movements in Georgia. So certainly that's the one we'll have comments on and stay engaged in at the congressional level as this moves forward. Another part of the DRIVE Act was creates assistance for major project grants, similar to the Tiger program, where grants ranging from about $10 to $100 million. Just personally, we feel, as the Department of Transportation, we feel a little better with more of the formula-based programs than grant type of programs, just due to the competitive nature of those. Sometimes we have a challenge winning competitive nature grants in Georgia. Also, the DRIVE Act includes provisions to help streamline and expedite project delivery, which sounds good. We like those tenets and those notions that anything that we can do to advance a federal project is very important to us. So we like those tenets and provisions there. But they come with a little bit of a negative in the fact that the details would require that Federal Highway Administration be the agency that coordinates schedules with all the federal regulatory agencies such as the EPA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, just to name a few, and to get a consensus on a schedule before we would advance a project. And that's just one of those things that as Georgia, we feel like we much rather be in the driver's seat of schedules and working collaboratively with these agencies and not have a little bit more federal input. Again, a very good notion, a very good tenet to streamline project delivery that we fully support, but these are the kind of details we'll be working forward with now as Congress is back in session. So a lot of good tenets. Some of our concerns obviously we'll vet out, and as everybody knows, there's no perfect bill, but we'll work toward making it the very best we can for Georgia and the nation. So what's next is this really needs to get resolved before October 29th. Again, there may be enough funding at the federal level to carry through the end of the calendar year, but again, that's just sort of punting the ball, if you will. Georgia would really like to see the 6-year transportation bill keeping those same tenets of MAP 21. Again, working through some of the smaller details that need to be worked out. And we feel like that would be a good solution that gives Georgia certainty going forward, because we need this federal certainty, because that was the premise that the Transportation Funding Act of 2015 was based on, was additional dollars on top of the federal level federal spending. And anything less than that would be doing a disservice to our legislature and governor, who worked very hard to bring forward transportation funding for Georgia over and above, to take care of the critical things that we need to do in Georgia over and above what we had federally. So let's move into the Transportation Funding Act of 2015, aka HB 170. And on July 1st, 2015, all the tenets of the excise tax and the user fees went into effect. And I did not find this newspaper headline anywhere in Georgia, because it was not a disaster. July 1st came and went, and I don't even think there was hardly a blip on the radar about anything that was related to the funding or the fees or the change in excise tax or sales tax from gas to excise tax. So it's amazing. There was a few bloggers out on the end of June saying to fill up before July 1st because gas was about to go up. And indeed, on this chart, if you look at that red line, that was June 30th, and July 1st is immediately to the right, and you can see that gas prices have steadily declined since July 1st. And when we look at the 3-month trend in Atlanta, from our friends at GasBuddy.com, you can see that gas prices have fell pretty linearly to probably the lowest. I think it was reported last week, the lowest Labor Day gas prices in a number of years. So that certainly is good news, because obviously lower gas prices is a good thing. Of people, again, a sign of a good economy. People are out and about, doing commerce across this state, and that's a good sign. Also, reading from different information about petroleum prices, it looks like petroleum prices will continue to be steady or fall throughout the rest of this year, which is positive as well. So that's a good trend. Now, transparency is always very important to us at the Georgia Department of Transportation, and we always want to tell you when we get it right and when we get it wrong, and we got it wrong. We thought that gas would go up about 6 or 7 cents a gallon, and we talked about, prior to HB 170 being passed, that it might cost the average consumer an additional $2.68 a month in taxes, and it would probably equate to about a cup of coffee. And so we got it wrong. Gas prices went down. Starbucks went up. So here you can see July 7th, just right after the gas tax was in place, Starbucks announced a 5 to 20 cents increase for their beverage, and you can see on this headline that they jumped all the way to a venti, went all the way from $2.45 to a jump of 11 cents, almost to $3.43 up in New York. So more costly than a gallon of gas. So just again, in the vein of transparency, we have to admit when we get it wrong. The other thing that was a little concerning was some of the fees that went in place, and obviously a controversial fee that went into place was the hotel fee for the stay. But I give you this headline just from a few weeks ago. Atlanta hotels hit record occupancy levels in July, so it looks like people still came to Atlanta. Also, there was another headline recently about the number of hotel rooms under construction now. So it looks like people are still coming to Atlanta. And the early indicators from Department of Revenue sounds very positive. Still a lot of questions circling around the actual collection of the fee, so remittance of that may be a lag as the hotel operators and understand how to remit and to pass those fees forward to the Department of Revenue. So anyway, the sky didn't fall on July 1. Things look positive, other than Starbucks going up. But with the decreased gas prices, we feel like you can still afford Starbucks. So we think all's going to be okay. My wife is happy. So let's transition now from sort of those headlines of what happened after the passage of the Transportation Funding Act of 2015 to go back and reaffirm the tenets of why that funding was needed. And in this graph, or these two graphs, the left was our current spend rate of taking care, of our pavements at about $100 million a year. Don't worry about the graph. Just know that when you see things sloping from left to right in a declining way, that's bad. The more orange and yellow you see was bad. On the right side now, with the Transportation Funding Act of 2015 and the revenues that are expected to receive, that's a $250 million per year expenditure for capital maintenance of our roadways. And you can see that now those curves become a lot flatter. It's going to take a little bit of time. You can see they still decline a little bit, but from 2015 to 2023, they all stay about the same. So that's going to be important because good pavements across the state provide for excellent mobility, reduced car repair, and overall maintenance of vehicles, which is, again, really important for Georgia to be competitive. Now, it's going to take initially probably a little more, probably take at least $300 million initially to sort of slow the downward trend down that you see on the graph on the left to get to be sustainable to more like on the graph on the right. So we're very excited about that because now we'll have a revenue stream to do so. Also, we talked about one of the major tenets, and I think that of HB 170 and the funding that was necessary was to take care of Georgia's bridges. And I think everybody understands the criticality of a bridge from safety and just pure mobility functions. When you think about Georgia's assets, over 8,000 locally owned bridge and about 6,700 state-owned bridges and culverts. And when you start looking at all the bridges across the state, the average age is 44 years old. And most bridges were only designed to be for a design life of 50 years. We now strive for a 75-year design life. We actually have one bridge in the state that still has traffic on it that's 112 years old. So that was a pretty good investment on that one. The average bridge handles almost 18,000 vehicles per day. And of course, the bridge that has the most traffic on it's right here in Atlanta with over 335,000 vehicles a day going across it. So just to give a little perspective of how critical our bridges are. But you know, it doesn't have to be the interstate bridge that's the critical bridge. It can be the rural bridge like on this slide that helps the farmer get his crops out of the field into market that has a significant impact on our economy. So we must take care of all our bridges, no matter if they're on the interstate, a state route, or a county road, because it does have a tremendous effect on the economy of the state. GDOT has about 1,600 structures or bridges that need to be replaced over the next years. And That means we need to be replacing about 90 a year. There's about 2,400 bridges on the city streets and county roads that need to be replaced over 20 years. And so that means you need to be replacing a little over 100, maybe 110 or so, if you get them on a 75-year birthday. So just think about bridges that when they become 75 years old, it's time to get a new one. And so that becomes sort of the service life. So those are the targets that we're going to be driving toward. And we can't say enough for the legislature and the governor moving forward with a $100 million bond in this year's budget to advance bridges. We're able to advance 26 more bridges than we would have prior to receiving HB 170 funds and revenues from the Transportation Funding Act of 2015. So that was a big investment in Georgia by advancing $100 million of bonds, general obligation bonds, for improving bridges. So very important. But as we talk about sort of these two maintenance areas of taking care of bridges and our roadways, let's not lose sight of the major projects that are ongoing now, and that gives us a little bit of a glimpse into the future. We have several major projects underway now. In fact, we have over 50 miles of managed lanes that are either under construction or under project development, meaning that a contract's been let but dirt's not turning yet. That's huge. 50 miles of managed lanes along our freeways is probably as big as anything in this nation. It certainly will become one of the biggest managed lane systems in this nation that gives drivers choices and opportunities for improved mobility. And also it improves the transit experience through express buses that now have guaranteed trip times and system reliability. So that's very important. You can see a couple of these projects that we have underway now. The Northwest Corridor, I-75 Express Lane south of Atlanta, down in Henry County. You can't miss that when you travel south. The I-85 extension of new lanes extending further north up to Hamilton Mill area in Gwinnett County. And of course, probably the biggest project we have that will have a tremendous impact on regional mobility is the I-285 at State Route 400 project, which we're now in project procurement, and by the end of this calendar year, we will announce a best value proposer. There's 4 teams competing for that now. And again, $1 billion investment. But of course, anybody around Georgia knows that 285 and 400 is the valve, if you will, that controls traffic to the north and the east and the south. And it certainly has a tremendous amount of traffic volume. Almost 500,000 people traverse that intersection every day, either on 400 or 285. As I was out in Wyoming, it reminded me that actually more people go through that interchange in a day than are in Wyoming. So to give a little perspective. So there's a tremendous amount of traffic there. But so let's not lose sight that despite we need to take care of our critical infrastructure maintenance and bridges and roads, Georgia's been pretty successful by innovatively working on projects like this. And it gives us a platform to continue to go forward to do more projects like this to improve mobility, tying it back to that 2015 Urban Mobility Report. We don't want Georgia to be near the top of that list anywhere, because we want Georgia to stay competitive economically, and we don't want people to say, hey, Atlanta traffic stinks, we don't want to come to Atlanta because of that. So we've got a lot of good projects underway and several more to come. Again, what the Transportation Funding Act of 2015 does is lets us begin to continue to implement our strategic plan on freight and freight logistics. Obviously, with the Savannah Harbor expansion project that's ongoing now, with actually a lot of work going on there now, getting ready to the actual dredging of the channel. There's property being bought. There's contracts with the Corps underway to dredge out in the ocean coming into the river. There's the recovery of a Confederate battleship that's being recovered now that had to be done before the dredging can be done. So there's a lot of things that are already underway to get ready for that harbor expansion project, and of course the widening of the Panama Canal being completed. So Georgia's got a freight plan, again, with a lot of stakeholders. Many of you may be on the phone that help participate and bring valuable data to the table so that we can have the right plan in place. We need to continue on the land side investment to accommodate the growth in trucks. We've identified $18 billion in needs through the year 2050, and basically you get about a $65 billion return on GDP. So that's a pretty good rate of return, $18 billion to generate $65 billion. We'll take that all day long. So we're going to be able to be ready to move forward. In the next slide that we'll show is one that was shown to the House and Senate Transportation Committees, and talking about what needs were. And of course, when I made the presentation to them, we said, well, to put Georgia where we really want Georgia to be, we need 2.1 to 2.5 billion additional dollars. And of course, as the Joint Study Committee identified, they came up with the same dollar figure for their work. So we sort of confirmed and affirmed each other. And of course, HB 170, or Transportation Funding Act of 2015, is proposed to generate slightly over $1 billion in a couple short years. So we know that the first needs that we've identified, we've talked about already, was that pavement resurfacing and the routine maintenance circled in green, which I have not spoken about routine maintenance. But think about all the things that have to be done on the roads: patching the potholes, fixing the rough spots, picking up litter, cutting the grass, all the basic things that have to be done. We want to provide a better level of service and a better experience from all Georgians and all the people that come to Georgia by taking care of our basic maintenance activities. So we said we needed an additional $200 million into routine maintenance to do that. We're going to do that through contracts, and we're not adding people, but we're going to do this through private sector contracts. So we're excited about that and looking for a much improved, again, level of service and quality of just the general roadside appearance and conditions across the state. So HB 170 provides us the ability to do that. The resurfacing I've already spoken of, and that what that leaves is the other things that need to be done, which I've highlighted sort of in an orange. So when you take your total needs, this is where you start making decisions. Obviously, the bridges, we had $100 million extra this last year for the bonds. We'll continue to invest more in bridges, probably to the tune of $200 to $300 million, not 456 as shown here. Obviously, traffic operations is very important. That's the quick fix things: building turn lanes, traffic signals, roundabouts, innovative intersections to keep traffic moving, and also from the safety component. And then obviously down toward the bottom you can see total unfunded capital needs. Such goes back to the freight logistics, widening the interstates, having our interstates such that freight can flow freely, working on managed lanes in and around Metro Atlanta, continuing the great work that's been done this far. So when you total all that up, that's where we are in the decision-making process now, working with Jay Roberts, our Director of Planning, who's planning out a 10-year look of projects and of what the fund distribution would be as required by the legislation. So we're working through that now. One thing to note too is a footnote. I probably should make it bigger and not have a footnote. This does not include the additional revenue that goes to the cities and counties. So cities and counties were able to retain their local sales tax on gas and their SPLOST programs, but also the excise tax will increase, which then goes directly to them, to the cities and counties through our local maintenance improvement grant program. So it's expected that they could receive an additional $60 to $70 million out to the cities and counties based on the excise tax. So that's a win-win, as I look at it, for helping our cities and counties with their critical infrastructure needs as well. So it's a very exciting time. There's a tremendous amount of work being done now in the department of getting ready to receive this additional revenue that will be coming forward in the next budget year. It's a lot of work to stand up this kind of additional revenue, but we're very excited about it. Again, we're looking at contracting opportunities across the state will be greatly increased. We're going to get back out and be able to take care of the things that we've always known we've needed to do for our critical infrastructure that we've talked about today on the webinar, as well as do other things. And one of the things, again, we cannot talk enough about and continue to invest in is safety, because we need your help. To date, there has been 876 fatalities on Georgia roadways. That's about 12% higher than it was last year at this time. That's a grave concern. Nationally, the national average is up about 14% across the nation on fatalities. So Georgia is not like the rest of this nation, but that's unacceptable. Every one of those numbers is a life that affects people, families, their husbands, wives, sons, daughters, cousins, aunts, uncles, you name it. It has a ripple effect of all 876 fatalities that's happened on Georgia's roadways this year. Some of the things that are concerning is that we're seeing in these fatalities, only 39% of them were wearing seat belts. It's unfathomable. 74% of those fatalities resulted from driver behavior. 65% of the fatalities were from drivers basically not staying in their lane. Another statistic that's very concerning is that 49% of fatalities were single vehicles. Nobody else was involved. So obviously something's going on. We've put it in 3 simple categories and ask that you share this with your family and friends, and just simply remind them to first, buckle up. Seems like a no-brainer, but we've got a problem when only 39% are wearing seat belts. Second is, we all know this, but we're all tempted, is don't text and drive. Turn it off, put it in the trunk. There's actually an app for that. Actually, there's little apps for that. So do it. Don't be distracted. Even talking hands-free is a distraction. But I know we all have to conduct business, and I know we're all tempted. But please, don't text and drive. We know better. It's becoming an epidemic, almost like so drunk texting and driving. You can see people that are texting and driving because they're all over the place. You think they're drunk, but they're just texting. And lastly, drive alert. Obviously, we know not to drink and drive. We all know that. But there's another kind of distracted driving that's called drowsy driving, and that happens to all of us after we have that nice lunch and we're headed off and the sun's coming through the window and you get all comfy and cozy and you get a little drowsy. So that's a distraction too. So figure out how to overcome that. Whatever you do is up to you. Find your caffeine of choice if you must. But please, any kind of distracted driving or impaired driving, such as drowsy or under the influence of not only alcohol but prescription meds, please, we all know better, but please share this with your family and friends, because ultimately the life you save may be your own. And we certainly couldn't do any of this without the help of the Georgia State Patrol and the Governor's Office of Highway Safety. Georgia Department of Education actually is helping us outreach to our schools. So we want everybody to drive alert and arrive alive. So please pass that along. Sort of in summary, I can tell you wholeheartedly and assuredly that Georgia's best days are ahead for transportation. What HB 170 did, the transportation funding after 2015, I don't think people fully understand the positivity of this and what it's going to mean for Georgia, not for next year and not for the next year, but for decades to come, because it has provisions that keep up and keep pace with inflation and funding needs, all based on the assumption of at least level federal funding. That's why that middle part of this presentation was so important, that you understand what's going on federally. But I'm excited. Everybody should be excited that we're going to put Georgia where it needs to be, which is the top state in this nation to do business in, and that we're going to provide the lifestyle and that people want, and be able to provide for the economic prosperity of Georgia. So our best days are truly ahead. I thank everybody on this webinar for their support of transportation, and the people that are around this table today here at the Chamber. Thanks for all of their support, because we would not have this opportunity today as the Georgia DOT if it wasn't for the support of all the many stakeholders that have been involved to bring transportation ahead. And we have to stand shoulder to shoulder now to deliver on what has been articulated as our needs are, to get there, get it done, again, to put Georgia's best foot forward ahead. So Sully, I really appreciate the opportunity. I'll turn it back over to you as moderator, and I believe you may have some questions. I hope they're easy. If they're not, Josh Waller is here with us, Department of Transportation. He's certainly capable.
Well, since this is a webinar, Josh can write down the answers for you, and no one will know. Well, Commissioner, we thank you for being with us this morning. It's an honor and a privilege to have you with us, and it's great after so many years of transportation dialogue in Georgia being about the need that wasn't being met. It's great to finally have conversations about increased revenue and the ability to do things that are so needed for our transportation network and ultimately our economic development of our state as a result of the passage of HB 170. Certainly hope that everyone shares your optimism about what will happen in Washington, D.C. later this year with the federal funding, and certainly know that y'all are in close conversation with members of our delegation, as many of the folks in this room and on this webinar have been, and it seems like there is at least broad consensus that everyone understands that we don't need a short-term patch, we need a long-term bill. But a lot of folks, I think, don't understand how short-term patches versus a long-term bill really impact the state's ability to plan projects, not just deliver on projects that are already completed. Would you maybe want to expand on that as far as how the short-term bills really negatively impact our transportation planning process?
Yeah, absolutely, Sully. And the reality is right now there's not even a transportation bill for next year or the year after. And transportation planning, regrettably, is a long process, and you need to plan for projects. If there's a major project that needs to be done 5 years from now, we need to be working on it today. Regrettably, it takes a long time, and that's going to be one of the benefits of HB 170 is that we don't necessarily have to follow all the federal regulations. We have to follow all the federal laws, but not necessarily all the regulations and some of the bureaucracy that goes along with it, so we can speed things up. But as it relates to this short-term extensions, what it does is it impairs us to be able to deliver things when they're ready to be delivered. And really, from a planning point of view, it's very hard to plan when you do not even have funding available. A few times this year, we didn't have funding even for the entire year, so it's very hard to plan and especially meet the public's expectations that when we say we're going to deliver a project on a certain day and be out there with barrels in the road and getting underway with a project, you just can't meet it. The transportation planning process, we have to every year show 4 years of financially constrained projects for the federal process. So when you don't know what your funding level may be, it's very hard to plan and, again, set expectations. And managing the public's expectations is key and critical. It's just, without being able to do that, you look incompetent and inept, and that's not a position as a state agency we want to be in. We want to be able to tell you when we get something ready, and when it's ready to go, it's time to go and get it done so the user can use it when it's finally built.
Well, certainly there's been a tremendous advance in the public perception of the department over the past few years and its ability to deliver projects on time and on budget, and certainly a lot of national rankings of the department as one of the best departments of transportation in the nation for delivering projects on time and on or under budget. One of the things you touched on, and one way to deliver those projects sooner and less expensively, is to use state funds rather than federal funds. Most folks on the call probably understand federal funds come with a lot of federal strings and regulations and hoop jumping that make projects cost more and take longer. One of the things that I know you've talked about is the ability that HB 170 and the funding stream created by that gives the department to use federal funds for maintenance and resurfacing projects and state funds for capital projects. Do you want to maybe expand on that?
Absolutely, and a great point, and that's exactly what some of the work going on now is with our planning division, and our Jay Roberts is our planning director, is working through looking at key critical capital type projects that have been stalled out or impaired due to trying to follow federal regulatory processes and trying to figure out how now we leverage our state dollars to those projects and take the federal money that was anticipated to be used on those projects and move over into more of those capital maintenance type projects and or bridges where there's a less of environmental regulations that you have to go through. It's a simplified process. Obviously, there's not as much work, environmental work needed to be done to go resurface a road than it is to go widen a lane, a road from 2 lanes to 4 lanes. So that, again, now Georgia is uncoupled from having to be totally dependent on the federal dollar for everything we've done from a capital maintenance or capital construction type project. So now we have that flexibility and agility. As I always say, we're taking one out of Florida's playbook, where Florida's always moving their bigger projects ahead with their state dollars and using their federal dollars for things such as their maintenance and maintenance type projects and some of their safety type projects. So that we're going to do the same thing. So it's really given us a ability to do things like we've never done before, to be strategic. And one thing you mentioned too is we feel like that we can certainly shorten the time frame to delivering projects, which turns into less money because time is money, and the sooner you can get it to construction, you're not having to deal with inflationary kind of things and just the cost of doing business. Never gets cheaper. So that we're very excited about that ability.
Absolutely. Well, time is money, and transportation is ultimately economic development. It's the circulatory system for our economy, and there's been a lot of focus in Georgia over the past few years on the expansion of Savannah Harbor and the increase of freight. We got a question from one of the participants. With such a focus on freight mobility, how does freight rail fit into the department's plans?
Yeah, well, actually, good question. The department has actually just finished up our state rail study, in which freight rail is considered. We certainly work with our 2 Class 1 railroads in Georgia to understand their needs and development and understanding what that is, but also the short lines of Georgia as well. Georgia's blessed to have many short lines that feed into those Class 1 rail lines. So all those come into the picture. Those are all considered. Obviously, a good announcement just about a month ago now, the new intermodal facility up in the north part of the state. And again, that rail to truck transition, and obviously there's an intermodal port down in Cordele. So that goes into our planning. It goes into our thoughts, and not only taking a step away from freight rail, but that last mile connectivity piece is so critical that we work very closely with economic development and try to understand where those last miles of connectivity are for the movement of goods. But freight rail certainly has a Georgia, and here sitting in Atlanta, being starting with a rail history, certainly freight rail is very important to moving goods in and out of the ports. And I know the Ports Authority actively work with the railroads and actually have some plans to try to do some expansion to make it even more efficient of getting freight out of the port on rail.
Well, Commissioner, we're just about out of time. I know there were some questions about further additional information that could be obtained. If you're on the webinar and you'd like to get some additional information, go to gatransport.org, and there's plenty of information there on the website and reports and studies. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out via email to Seth Milliken, the Executive Director of the Georgia Transportation Alliance. On behalf of the Georgia Transportation Alliance, thank you all for being with us this morning. Again, thank you, Commissioner, for being with us this morning. Thank you for the information that's provided. And we look forward to being with you all again on our next webinar. This concludes our webinar. Thank you so much for being with us. Goodbye.